Talk. The Triumph of 1853. 1853. We have not sought to evade the difficulties of our position. We have not attempted to counteract them by narrow or flimsy expedients. We have proposed plans which will go some way towards closing up many vexed financial questions. While we have sought to do justice to intelligence and skill as compared with property, while we have sought to do justice to the great laboring community by further extending their relief from indirect taxation, we have not been guided by any desire to set one class against another. Gladstone, 1853. Mr. Gladstone began this year, so important both to himself and to the country, with what he described as a short but active and pleasant visit to Oxford. He stayed at Christ Church with Dr. Jacobson, of whom it was observed that he always looked as if on the point of saying something extremely piercing and shrewd, only it never came. He paid many calls, dined at Oriel, had a luncheon and made a speech in the hall at Balliol, passed busy days and brisk evenings, and filled up whatever spare moments he could find or manufacture, with treasury papers, books on taxation, consolidated annuities, and public accounts, alternating with dips into Lamennais, the bold and passionate French mystic, fallen angel of his church, most moving of all the spiritual tragedies of that day of heroic idealists. On February 3 he moved into the house of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in that best known of all streets which is not a street, where he was destined to pass some 22 of the 41 years of the public life that lay before him. He had a correspondence with Mr. Disraeli, his predecessor, on the valuation of the furniture in the official house. There was question, also, of the robe that passes down under some law of exchange from one chancellor to another on an apparently unsettled footing. The tone on this high concern was not wholly amicable. Mr. Gladstone notes especially in his diary that he wrote a draft of one of his letters on a Sunday, as being, I suppose, the day most favorable to self-control, while Mr. Disraeli at last suggests that Mr. Gladstone should really consult Sir Charles Wood, who was at least a man of the world. Such are the angers of celestial minds. At an early cabinet, February 5, he began the battle that lasted in various shapes all the rest of his life. It was on a question of reducing the force in the Pacific. Lord Aberdeen, Granville, Molesworth, and I were for it. We failed. What was the case for this particular retrenchment I do not know, nor does it matter. Fiercer engagements, and many of them, were to follow. Meanwhile he bent all the energies of his mind to the other front of financial questions, to raising money rather than expending it, and with unwearied industry applied himself to solve the problem of redistributing the burdens and improving the machinery of taxation. For many years circumstances had given to finance a lively and commanding place in popular interest. The protracted discussion on the Corn Law, conducted not only in Senate and Cabinet, but in country marketplaces and thronged exchanges, in the farmers' ordinary and at huge gatherings in all the large towns in the kingdom, had agitated every class in the community. The battle between free trade and protection, ending in a revolution of our commercial system, had awakened men to the enormous truth, as to which they are always so soon ready to relapse into slumber, that budgets are not merely affairs of arithmetic, but in 1,000 ways go to the root of the prosperity of individuals, the relations of classes, and the strength of kingdoms. The finance of the Whigs in the years after the Reform Bill had not only bewildered Parliament, but had filled merchants, bankers, shipowners, manufacturers, shopkeepers, and the whole array of general taxpayers with perplexity and dismay. Peel recovered a financial equilibrium and restored public confidence, but Peel was gone. The Whigs who followed him after 1846 had once more labored under an unlucky star in this vital sphere of national affairs. They performed the unexampled feat of bringing forward 4 budgets in a single year, the first of them introduced by Lord John Russell himself as Prime Minister. By 1851 floundering had reached a climax. Finance had thus discredited one historical party, it had broken up the other. It was finance that overthrew weak governments and hindered the possibility of a strong one. Fiscal confusion. Mr. Disraeli, the most unsparing of all the assailants of Peel, tried his own hand in 1852. To have the genius and the patience of a great partisan chief is one gift, and this he had. To grasp the complex material interests of a vast diversified society like the United Kingdom demands powers of a different order. The defeat of Mr. Disraeli's budget at the end of 1852 seemed to complete the circle of fiscal confusion. Every source of public income was the object of assault. Every indirect tax was to be reduced or swept away, and yet no two men appeared to agree upon the principles of the direct taxes that were to take their place. The window duty, the paper duty, the tax on advertisements, the malt tax, the stamp on marine insurances, were all to vanish, but even the most zealous reformers were powerless to fill the void. The Order Book of the House of Commons was loaded with motions about the income tax, and an important committee sat in 1851 to consider all the questions connected with the possibility of its readjustment and amendment. They could not even frame a report. The belief that it was essentially unjust to impose the tax at one and the same rate upon permanent and temporary incomes prevailed in the great mass, especially of the Liberal Party. Discussions arose all through this period, descending not only to the elementary principles of taxation, but, as Mr. Gladstone said, almost to the first principles of civilized society itself. Party distraction, ministerial embarrassment, adjournment after adjournment of a decision upon fundamental maxims of national taxation, such was the bewildered scene. At last a statesman appeared, a financier almost by accident, for, as we have seen, it was by no special choice of his own that Mr. Gladstone went to the Exchequer, but a financier endowed with a practical imagination of the highest class, with a combination of the spirit of vigorous analysis and the spirit of vigorous system, with the habit of unflagging toil, and above all, with the gift of indomitable courage. If anybody suggested the reappointment of Hume's committee, the idea was wisely dismissed. It was evidently, as Graham said, the duty of the executive government to lead the way and to guide public opinion in a matter of this crucial importance. It seemed impossible and unworthy to avoid a frank declaration about the income tax. He was strongly of opinion, March 15, that a larger measure would be carried with greater certainty and ease than simple renewal, and that a combination of income tax, gradually diminishing to a fixed term of extinction, with reduction of the interest of debt, and a review of the probate and legacy duties, afforded the best ground for a financial arrangement both successful and creditable. It was strong ideas of this kind that encouraged Mr. Gladstone to build on a broad foundation. The nature of his proceedings he set out in one of the most interesting of his political memoranda. The Liberals were, to all appearance, pledged to the reconstruction of the tax by their opinions, and the Tories by their party following. The small fraction of Peelites could probably be relied upon the other way, and some few individuals with financial knowledge and experience. The mission of the new government was described by Lord Aberdeen in the House of Lords as a financial mission, and the stress of it thus lay upon a person very ill-prepared. My opinions were with Peel, but under such circumstances it was my duty to make a close and searching investigation into the whole nature of the tax, and make up my mind whether there was any means of accepting or compounding with the existing state of opinion. I went to work, and labored very hard. When I had entered gravely upon my financial studies, I one day had occasion, I know not what, to go into the city and to call upon Mr. Samuel Gurney, to whom experience and character had given a high position there. He asked me with interest about my preparations for my budget, and he said, "One thing I will venture to urge, whatever your plan is, let it be simple." I was a man much disposed to defer to authority, and I attached weight to this advice. But as I went further and further into my subject, I became more and more convinced that, as an honest steward, I had no option but to propose the renewal of the tax in its uniform shape. I constructed much elaborate argument in support of my proposition, which I knew it would be difficult to answer. But I also knew that no amount of unassisted argument would suffice to overcome the obstacles in my way, and that this could only be done by large compensations in my accompanying propositions. So I was led legitimately on, until I had framed the most complicated scheme ever submitted to Parliament. The fabric planned. Truly has it been said that there is something repulsive to human nature in the simple reproduction of defunct budgets. Certainly, if anything can be more odious than a living tax, it is a dead one. It is as much as is consonant to biography to give an outline of the plan that was gradually wrought out in Mr. Gladstone's mind during the first 3 laborious months of 1853, and to mark the extraordinarily far-reaching and comprehensive character of the earliest of his 13 budgets. Its initial boldness lay in the adoption of the unusual course of estimating the national income roughly for a long period of 7 years, and assuming that expenditure would remain tolerably steady for the whole of that period. Just as no provident man in private life settles his establishment on the basis of 1 year or 2 years only, so Mr. Gladstone abandoned hand-to-mouth and took long views. "I ought, no doubt," he said afterwards, "to have pointed out explicitly that a great disturbance and increase of our expenditure would baffle my reckonings." Meanwhile, the fabric was planned on strong foundations and admirable lines. The simplification of the tariff of duties of customs, begun by Peel 11 years before, was carried forward almost to completion. Nearly 140 duties were extinguished, and nearly 150 were lowered. The tea duty was to be reduced in stages extending over 3 years from over 2 shillings to 1 shilling. In the Department of Excise, the high and injurious duty on soap, which brought into the Exchequer over £1,100,000 annually, was swept entirely away. In the same department, by raising the duties on spirits manufactured in Ireland nearer to the level of England and Scotland, a step was taken towards identity of taxation in the 3 kingdoms, by no means an unequivocal good. Miscellaneous provisions and minor aspects of the scheme need not detain us, but a great reform of rate and scale in the system of the assessed taxes, the reduction of the duty on the beneficent practice of life insurance from half a crown to 6pence on the £100, and the substitution of a uniform receipt stamp, were no contemptible contributions to the comfort and well-being of the community. Advertisements in newspapers became free of duty. 284. Keystone of the budget. The keystone of the budget in Mr. Gladstone's conception was the position to be assigned in it to the income tax. This he determined to renew for a period of 7 years, for 2 years at 7pence in the pound, for 2 years more at 6pence, and for the last 3 at 5pence. By that time he hoped that Parliament would be able to dispense with it. Meanwhile it was to be extended to Ireland, in compensation for the remission of a debt owed by Ireland to the British Treasury of between 4 and 5 millions. It was to be extended, also, at a reduced rate of 5pence, to incomes between £150 and £100, the former having hitherto been the line of total exemption. From the retention of the income tax as a portion of the permanent and ordinary finance of the country the Chancellor of the Exchequer was wholly and strongly averse, and so he remained for more than 20 years to come. In order, however, to meet a common and a just objection, that under this impost intelligence, enterprise, and skill paid too much and property paid too little, he resolved upon a bold step. He proposed that the legacy duty, hitherto confined to personal property passing on death, either by will or by inheritance and not by settlement, should henceforth be extended to real property, and to both descriptions of property passing by settlement, whether real or personal. In a word, the legacy duty was to extend to all successions whatever. This was the proposal that in many senses cut deepest. It was the first rudimentary breach in the ramparts of the territorial system, unless, indeed, we count as first the abolition of the Corn Law, 285. Mr. Gladstone eagerly disclaimed any intention of accelerating by the pressure of fiscal enactment changes in the tenure of landed property, and the letters which the reader has already seen, pages 345-9, show the high social value that he invariably set upon the maintenance of the old landed order. The succession duty, as we shall find, for the time disappointed his expectations, for he counted on 2 millions, and in fact it yielded little more than half of one. But it secured for its author the lasting resentment of a powerful class. Such was the scheme that Mr. Gladstone now worked out in many weeks of toil that would have been slavish, were it not that toil is never slavish when illuminated by a strenuous purpose. When by and by the result had made him the hero of a glorious hour, he wrote to Lord Aberdeen, April 19, I had the deepest anxiety with regard to you, as our chief, lest by faults of my own I should aggravate the cares and difficulties into which I had at least helped to bring you, and the novelty of our political relations with many of our colleagues, together with the fact that I had been myself slow, and even reluctant, to the formation of a new connection, filled me with an almost feverish desire to do no injustice to that connection now that it was formed, and to redeem the pledge you generously gave on my behalf, that there would be no want of cordiality and zeal in the discharge of any duties which it might fall to me to perform on behalf of such a government as was then in your contemplation. 13, 14, 15 hours a day he toiled at his desk. Treasury officials and trade experts, soap deputations and post-horse deputations, representatives of tobacco and representatives of the West India interest, flocked to Downing Street day by day all through March. If he went into the city to dine with the Lord Mayor, the lamentable hole thus made in his evening was repaired by working till 4 in the morning upon customs reform, Australian mints, budget plans of all kinds. It is characteristic that even this mountain load of concentrated and exacting labor did not prevent him from giving a Latin lesson every day to his second boy. 2. Some days before the day appointed for my statement, says Mr. Gladstone, I recited the leading particulars to my able and intelligent friend Cardwell, not in the cabinet but then holding office as president of the Board of Trade. He was so bewildered and astounded at the bigness of the scheme, that I began to ask myself, have I a right to ask my colleagues to follow me amidst all these rocks and shoals? In consequence I performed a drastic operation upon the plan, and next day I carried to Lord Aberdeen a reduced and mutilated scheme which might be deemed by some politicians to be weaker but safer. I put to Lord Aberdeen the question I had put to myself, and stated my readiness, if he should think it called for, to make this sacrifice to the probable inclinations of my colleagues. But he boldly and wisely said, I take it upon myself to ask you to bring your original and whole plan before the cabinet. I thought this an ample warrant. The budget in cabinet. At last, after Mr. Gladstone had spent an hour at the palace in explaining his scheme to the Prince Consort, the budget was opened to the cabinet, April 9, in a speech of 3 hours, an achievement, I should suppose, unparalleled in that line, for a cabinet consists of men each with pretty absorbing preoccupations of his own. The exposition was as ingenious, Lord Aberdeen told Prince Albert, as clear, and for the most part as convincing, as anything I have ever heard. Gladstone, said Lord Aberdeen later, 1856, does not weigh well against one another different arguments, each of which has a real foundation. But he is unrivaled in his power of proving that a specious argument has no real foundation. On the succession bill the whole cabinet was against him. He delivered to us much the same speech as he made in the House of Commons. At its close we were all convinced. 286. Differences that might easily become serious speedily arose upon details in the minds of 2 or 3 of them, and for some days the Prime Minister regarded the undertaking as not only difficult but perilous. Sir Charles Wood, in Cabinet, April 11, strongly disapproved of the extension of income tax to Ireland, and to the lowering of the exemption line. On Ireland the plan would lay more than 500,000 of new taxation, whereas much of the relief, such as soap and assessed taxes, would not touch her. 287. Palmerston thought it a great plan, perfectly just, and admirably put together, only it opened too many points of attack, and it could never be carried. Disraeli was on the watch, the Irish would join him, so would the Radicals, while the succession duty, to which Palmerston individually had great objection, would estrange many Conservatives. Lord John Russell perceived difficulties, but he did not see an alternative. Graham then fell in, disliked the twofold extension of the income tax, and thought they should only take away half the soap tax. Lord Lansdowne, a great Irish landlord, agreed with him. Mr. Gladstone told them that he was willing to propose whatever the cabinet might decide on, except one thing, namely, the breaking up of the basis of the income tax, that he could not be a party to, he should regard it as a high political offence. With this reservation he should follow their judgment, but he strongly adhered to his whole plan. Lord Aberdeen said, you must take care your proposals are not unpopular ones. Mr. Gladstone replied that it was after applying the test of popularity that he was convinced the budget would be damaged beforehand by some of the small changes that had been suggested. At the end of a long and interesting discussion, there stood for the whole budget Lord John, Newcastle, Clarendon, Molesworth, Gladstone, with Argyll and Aberdeen more or less favourable, for dropping the 2 extensions of income tax and keeping half the soap duty, Lansdowne, Graham, Wood, more or less leaning towards them, Palmerston and Granville. They agreed to meet again the next day, April 12, when they got into the open sea. Wood stuck to his text. Lansdowne suggested that an increased spirit duty and an income tax for Ireland together would be something like a breach of faith. Palmerston thought they would be beaten, but he would accept the budget provided they were not to be bound to dissolve or resign upon such a point as to the 2 extensions of the income tax. Lord John said that if they were beaten on differentiating the tax, they would have to dissolve. Palmerston expressed his individual opinion in favour of a distinction for precarious incomes, and would act in that sense if he were out of the government. As it was, he assented. Argyll created a diversion by suggesting the abandonment of the Irish spirit duty. Mr. Gladstone admitted that he thought the spirit duty the weakest point of the plan, though warrantable and tenable on the whole. At last, after further patient and searching discussion, the Cabinet, finding that the suggested amendments cut against one another, were for adopting the entire budget, the dissensions being Lansdowne, Graham, Wood, and Herbert. Graham was full of ill auguries, but said he would assent and assist. Wood looked grave, and murmured that he must take time. Cabinet misgivings. In the course of these preliminaries, Lord John Russell had gone to Graham, very uneasy about the income tax. Graham, though habitually desponding, bade him be of good cheer. Their opponents, he said, were in numbers strong, but the budget would be excellent to dissolve upon, and Lord John admitted that they would gain 40 seats. They agreed, however, in Graham's language, that it would never do to play their trump card until the state of the game actually required it. Lord John confessed that he was no judge of figures, somewhat of a weakness and a critic of a budget, and Graham comforted him by the reply that he was at any rate the best judge living of House of Commons tactics. The position of the government in the House of Commons was notoriously weak. The majority that had brought them into existence was excessively narrow. It had been well known from the first that if any of the accidents of a session should happen to draw the Tories, the Irish, and the Radicals into one lobby, ministers would find themselves in a minority. Small defeats occurred. The budget was only 4 days off. Mr. Gladstone enters in his diary, spoke against Gibson, beaten by 200 to 169. Our 3rd time this week. Very stiff work this. Ellis said dissolution would be the end of it. We agreed in the House to a cabinet tomorrow. Herbert and Cardwell, to whom I spoke, inclined to dissolve. Next day, April 15, the cabinet met in a flutter, for the same tactics might well be repeated, whenever Mr. Disraeli should think the chances good. Lord John adverted to the hostility of the Radicals as exhibited in the tone of the debate, and hinted the opinion that they must take in a reef or two. Mr. Gladstone doubted whether the budget could live in that House, whatever form it might assume, but even with such perils he should look upon the whole budget as less unsafe than a partial contraction. Graham took the same view of the disposition of Parliament: keen opposition, lukewarm support, the necessity of a greater party sympathy and connection to enable them to surmount the difficulties of a most unusual and hazardous operation. But he did not appear to lean to dissolution, and the older members of the cabinet generally declared themselves against it. In the end we went back to the position that we must have a budget on Monday, but Clarendon, Herbert, and Palmerston joined the chorus of those who said the measure was too sharp upon Ireland. The idea was then started whether we should go the length of the entire remission of the consolidated annuities, 288, and impose the income tax at 7p, with the augmented spirit duty. This view found favour generally, and I felt that some excess in the mere sacrifice of money was no great matter compared with the advantage of so great an approximation to equal taxation. Then, speaking with great deference, Gladstone repeated his belief once more that the entire budget was safer than a contracted one, both for the House and the country, and his conviction that if they proposed it, the name and fame of the government at any rate would stand well. Wood seemed still to hang back, but the rest of the cabinet now appeared well satisfied, and we parted, each resolved, and certainly more likely to stand or fall by the budget as a whole than we seemed to be on Wednesday. 3. The decisive cabinet was on Saturday, April 16. It was finally settled that the budget should be proposed as it stood, with its essential features unaltered. On Sunday, the Chancellor of the Exchequer went as usual twice to church, and read the Paradiso, but I was obliged, he says, with an accent of contrition, to give several hours to my figures. Monday brought the critical moment. April 18. Wrote minutes. Read Shakespeare at night. This day was devoted to working up my papers and figures for the evening. Then drove and walked with Mrs. Gladstone. Went at 4:30 to the House. Spoke 4 3/4 hours in detailing the financial measures, and my strength stood out well, thank God. Many kind congratulations afterwards. Herberts and Wortleys came home with us and had soup and negus. Laid before Parliament. The proceeding that figures here so simply was, in fact, one of the great parliamentary performances of the century. Lord Aberdeen wrote to Prince Albert that the display of power was wonderful. It was agreed in all quarters that there had been nothing like the speech for many years, and that under the impression of his commanding eloquence the reception of the budget had been most favourable. Lord John told the Queen the speech was one of the ablest ever made in the House of Commons. Mr. Pitt, in the days of his glory, might have been more imposing, but he could not have been more persuasive. Lord Aberdeen heard from Windsor the next day. The Queen must write a line to Lord Aberdeen to say how delighted she is at the great success of Mr. Gladstone's speech last night. We have every reason to be sanguine now, which is a great relief to the Queen. Prince Albert used the same language to Mr. Gladstone. I cannot resist writing you a line in order to congratulate you on the success of your speech of yesterday. I have just completed a close and careful perusal of it and should certainly have cheered had I a seat in the House. I hear from all sides that the budget has been well received. Trusting that your Christian humility will not allow you to be dangerously elated, I cannot help sending for your perusal the report which Lord John Russell sent to the Queen, feeling sure that it will give you pleasure, such approbation being the best reward a public man can have. On the cardinal question of the fortunes of the ministry, its effect was decisive. The Prime Minister wrote to Mr. Gladstone himself, April 19, while everybody is congratulating me on the wonderful impression produced in the House of Commons last night, it seems only reasonable that I should have a word of congratulation for you. You will believe how much more sincerely I rejoice on your account than on my own, although most assuredly, if the existence of my government shall be prolonged, it will be your work. To Madame de Leven Aberdeen said that Gladstone had given a strength and lustre to the administration which it could not have derived from anything else. No testimony was more agreeable to Mr. Gladstone than a letter from Lady Peel. I know the recollections, he replied, with which you must have written, and therefore I will not scruple to say that as I was inspired by the thought of treading, however unequally, in the steps of my great teacher and master in public affairs, so it was one of my keenest anxieties not to do dishonor to his memory, or injustice to the patriotic policy with which his name is forever associated. 289. Power of the performance. Greville makes a true point when he says that the budget speech has raised Gladstone to a great political elevation, and what is of far greater consequence than the measure itself, has given the country assurance of a man equal to great political necessities and fit to lead parties and direct governments. 290. Mr. Gladstone had made many speeches that were in a high degree interesting, ingenious, attractive, forcible. He now showed that besides and apart from all this, he was the possessor of qualities without which no amount of rhetorician's glitter commands the House of Commons for a single hour after the fireworks have ceased to blaze. He showed that he had precise perception, positive and constructive purpose, and a powerful will. In 1851, he had on 2 occasions exhibited the highest competency as a critic of the budget of Sir Charles Wood. On the memorable night in the previous December, when he had torn Mr. Disraeli's budget to pieces, he had proved how terrifying he could be in exposure and assault. He now triumphantly met the test that he had triumphantly applied to his predecessor, and presented a command of even more imposing resources in the task of responsible construction than he had displayed in irresponsible criticism. The speech was saturated with fact, the horizons were large, and the opening of each in the long series of topics, from Mr. Pitt and the Great War, down to the unsuspected connection between the repeal of the soap tax and the extinction of the slave trade in Africa, was exalted and spacious. The arguments throughout were close, persuasive, exhaustive. The moral appeal was in the only tone worthy of a great minister addressing a governing assembly, a masculine invocation of their intellectual and political courage. This is the intrepid way in which a strong parliament and a strong nation like to see public difficulties handled, and they now welcomed the appearance of a new minister, who rejected what he called narrow and flimsy expedients, of which so much had been seen in the last half-dozen years, who was not afraid to make a stand against heedless men with hearts apparently set on drying up one source of revenue after another, who did not shrink from sconcing the powerful landed phalanx like other people, and who at the same time boldly used and manfully defended the most unpopular of all the public imposts. In politics, the spectacle of sheer courage is often quite as good in its influence and effect as the best of logic. It was so here. While proposing that the income tax should come to an end in 7 years, he yet produced the most comprehensive analysis and the boldest vindication of the structure of the tax as it stood. His manner was plain, often almost conversational, but his elaborate examination of the principles of an income tax remains to this day a master example of accurate reasoning thrown into delightful form. He admitted all the objections to it, the inquisition that it entailed, the frauds to which it led, the sense in the public mind of its injustice in laying the same rate upon the holder of idle and secured public funds, upon the industrious trader, upon the precarious earnings of the professional man. It was these disadvantages that made him plan the extinction of the tax at the end of a definite period, when the salutary remissions of other burdens now proposed would have had time to bring forth their fruits. As was said by a later Chancellor of the Exchequer, this speech not only won universal applause from his audience at the time, but changed the convictions of a large part of the nation, and turned, at least for several years, a current of popular opinion which had seemed too powerful for any minister to resist. 291. The succession duty brought Mr. Gladstone into the first conflict of his life with the House of Lords. That land should be made to pay like other forms of property was a proposition denounced as essentially impracticable, oppressive, unjust, cowardly, and absurd. It was called ex post facto legislation. It was one of the most obnoxious, detestable, and odious measures ever proposed. Its author was a vulture soaring over society, waiting for the rich harvest that death would pour into his treasury. Lord Derby invoked him as a Phoenix Chancellor, in whom Mr. Pitt rose from his ashes with double luster, for Mr. Gladstone had ventured where Pitt had failed. He admitted that nothing short of the Chancellor's extraordinary skill and dexterity could have carried proposals so evil through the House of Commons. 292. Meanwhile the public counted up their gains: a remission on tea, good for 20 shillings a year in an ordinary household, a fall in the washing bill, a boon of a couple of pounds for the man who insured his life for 500, an easy saving of £10 a year in the assessed taxes, and so forth, the whole performance ending with a dissolving view of the decline and fall of the hated income tax. Succession duty and redemption. The financial proceedings of this year included a proposal for the redemption of South Sea stock and an attempted operation on the national debt, by the creation of new stocks bearing a lower rate of interest, 2 options of conversion being given to the holders of old stock. The idea of the creation of a 2.5% stock, said Mr. Gladstone in later years, though in those days novel, was very favorably received. 293.